For this part of the lecture, we'll be looking at the ovarian follicles and a little bit on the ovarian cycle. Ovarian follicles are actually round cellular structures that you actually find in your ovaries. They are literally fluid-filled sacs that actually contain your immature egg or your oocytes. So at the time of birth, a female will actually have about 1 million of these ovarian follicles, but by the time she reaches puberty, there's only about 3 to 400,000 left, and out of that, only about 3 to 400 will actually become matured and get ovulated during the entire reproductive period of a woman's life. So these ovarian follicles are actually found in the part of the cortex of the ovary. So your ovary actually literally has two sections, the cortex in the outer layer and the medulla in the middle. So all this cellular roundish structure that you are seeing here, these are all the ovarian follicles. So you can see them in like various stages of development around the cortex of your ovaries. So the ovarian follicles play an important role in actually secreting hormone during the ovarian cycle, especially your progesterone and your estrogen. So your ovarian follicles actually develop according to the different phases in the entire ovarian cycle. So literally the ovarian cycle can be divided into the follicular phase, which denotes the development of the ovarian follicle, and the luteal phase, which actually takes place after the ovulation. This is literally the phase where the corpus luteum actually is developing. So you have the follicular phase, then the ovulation, then the luteal phase will take place. This is showing you the cross section of the ovary with different stages of follicular development. And literally the ovarian cycle is divided into the follicular phase and the luteal phase. So the follicular phase usually starts off with the primordial follicles, which eventually develops into the primary, secondary, and finally the tertiary or Graafian follicles. And once Graafian follicle ruptures, it will release the oocyte. And upon that, the luteal phase actually takes place with the development of the corpus luteum, which eventually ends up as the corpus albicans. The follicular phase of your ovarian cycle actually starts off with the primordial follicles, and these are actually very small follicles that you'll actually find at the outer edges of your cortex of the ovary. And in this follicle is where you'll find your primary oocytes, which has been arrested at prophase of meiosis 1. And this actually goes back to the early embryogenic development, where the process of oogenesis was taking place when the embryo was forming. So the meiotic division actually stops at this phase, and once upon maturity or sexual maturity, the primary oocyte will then continue this cycle of its meiotic division. So at this stage, it is still at the prophase of meiosis 1. And if you look at the primordial follicle, it actually has a single layer of flattened ovarian epithelial cell, also known as the granulosa cell. So when the primordial follicle actually gets stimulated by the follicle stimulating hormones that are released from your anterior pituitary gland, they will eventually start growing. So what happens is the follicular cells that were surrounding them, the oocytes, will eventually undergo hypertrophy. That means they will increase in size, and they also will start proliferate to increase in numbers to form a stratum, or what we know as the zona granulosa. You can see it here. Okay, and besides that, you will also find a thick layer of glycoprotein being formed between the layer of the oocyte and the zona granulosa. Okay, so this is known as the zona pellucida, okay, which is a thick layer of glycoprotein. Besides that, you also find the stroma. Stroma are literally the connective tissue that makes up the structure of the ovaries. So the stroma of the ovaries around the follicle will actually start forming a capsule-like connective tissue coat, which is known as the theca. Following that, the primary follicle will actually eventually develop into a secondary follicle. The secondary follicle actually looks very similar to the primary follicle, except they are larger and they have actually more follicular cells. They are larger because their number of follicular cells are also starting to increase, and they actually have this multi-laminar kind of appearance. That means there's multiple layer of follicular cells that are surrounding this follicle. And one interesting thing that we will start observing is the accumulation of fluid known as the follicular fluid. Okay, within the follicles, you will start seeing fluid accumulating. And the moment you see this, you know this is already the secondary stage of the follicle's development. Okay, the follicular fluid literally serves as a nutrition to the developing oocyte, and the theca layer that was forming at the outer layer of the follicle will then differentiate into the theca interna and the theca externa. Okay, so the theca interna actually will consist of these roundish cells that are actually capable of secreting androgen and follicular fluid. So the androgen secreted by these theca cells will eventually be converted into estrogen by the granulosa cells of your follicle. The tertiary follicle is literally like a transition between your secondary follicle and your Graafian follicle. So in this phase, the granulosa cells of course will continue to proliferate and multiply. But what we will observe is actually all these fluid that was starting to form in your secondary follicle, they all will come together and merge and form one large collection of fluid known as the follicular antrum. So they form a follicular antrum with all this fluid being collected to one part of the follicle. So as the follicles reach their maturation stage, so the last phase of your follicular development is literally the Graafian follicle. So at this phase, the oocyte is actually it has actually completed its first meiotic division, and what we have is actually the secondary oocyte. Okay, and that too would have actually started its second meiotic division. So what we will observe in the Graafian follicle is this large collection of fluid, the antrum. It will become very prominent. You can see in the image below here. That makes the follicle actually looks very big, okay, because of this fluid accumulation. And also you will find your granulosa cells, all these cells surrounding the oocyte here. There will be some part that will be actually projecting into the antrum, and that is known as the cumulus oophorus. That's another structure that you will actually take note when you see a Graafian follicle. Okay, so attaching to the cumulus oophorus, you'll find your oocytes surrounded by the zona pellucida and a layer of your follicular cell. So this structure is known as the corona radiata. So the oocyte with the zona pellucida and the follicular cells that surround them are actually the structure that makes up corona radiata, and this will be the one that will be actually expelled during ovulation and will enter the fallopian tube. Besides that, in your Graafian follicle, you also will see there's a basement membrane known as the basal lamina that is formed between the granulosa cells as well as the theca interna. So what happens after ovulation? The ruptured follicle, your Graafian follicle, will actually collapse, okay, and it will be filled with blood clot. So the ruptured Graafian is what is we know as the corpus luteum. Okay, so this denotes the start of the luteal phase of your ovarian cycle. Okay, so what happens in this phase is the granulosa cells that were in your follicles earlier, Okay, they will eventually become enlarged and they become folded, so you can see this vesicular folding kind of structure of your corpus luteum. Okay, and they are no longer called the granulosa cell, they'll be known as the granulosa lutein cell. Same for your theca interna cell, they also become enlarged and glandular and will be known as theca lutein cells. Okay, so these theca granulosa lutein cells actually are responsible for secretion of your progesterone and also estrogen that will eventually inhibit the function of your FSH. Okay, so if pregnancy doesn't take place, your corpus luteum will eventually degenerate and become the corpus albicans. This is a histology image of a corpus luteum, so you can actually see how large the structure of a corpus luteum is. It literally takes up about 1/3 of the space of your ovaries. So besides that, you also have these atratic follicles that are labeled in this particular slide. Atratic follicles are literally the degenerating follicles, and these are literally the follicles that fail to develop. So what happens is they eventually will just deteriorate and degrade. So eventually the corpus luteum will actually start degenerating and it will become this pale white looking structure known as the corpus albicans. The corpus albicans has no cellular elements, that means there is no cells within this follicle, and it usually just consists of a fibrous tissue that eventually will shrink and become a small scar-like structure on the sides of your ovary. So this is the cross section of the ovaries that we looked at in the beginning of the lecture. So the entire changes of your follicle development can actually be summarized in this one image, and we can recap everything that we have actually gone through by just looking at all the changes of the in the follicle that is happening here. So you know your follicular stage starts off with your primordial follicles, which eventually develops to become the primary follicle upon the stimulation from your follicle stimulating hormone. And the primary follicle, then it develops the follicular cell, and the which is also known as the granulosa cell, and starts increasing in size and eventually forming the secondary follicle. You know it's a secondary follicle once you see the appearance of these follicular fluids within the follicle structure. And from there, the follicle actually grows further and matures to become what we know as the tertiary or Graafian follicle. And the Graafian follicle has the feature which is the very large antrum, okay, the fluid collection, the antrum. It also has the cumulus ophorus, as well as the structure of the corona radiata that is projecting into the antrum. And upon rupture, okay, when the Graafian follicle ruptures, the corona radiata is actually released into the fallopian tube. That means the oocyte is actually getting ovulated. And what happens after the rupturing of your Graafian follicle is actually the start of the luteal phase, in which you see the formation of your corpus luteum. And the corpus luteum eventually will develop and degenerate to become what we know as the corpus albicans. So this summarizes the entire follicular and the luteal phase of your ovarian cycle. So for the last part of the lecture, we're actually going to talk about the ovarian cycle, and there's actually a lot of hormones and a lot of structures involved in the cycle when we talk about the entire chart of the ovarian cycle. So I'm going to explain this in a bit slower manner so that you can actually follow through the changes that is happening in each of the section of the chart that we're going to talk about. So we'll just talk about the ovarian cycle very briefly, and this is a cycle that happens within in an average of 28 days and very much influenced by your hormonal levels. So what happens is literally the increasing levels of your FSH and LH, your follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, at the early stage of the ovarian cycle, which is the day 0, you can see with the increase of these hormones that are produced in the anterior pituitary gland, the follicles maturation stage actually start to happen. So the follicles actually start to grow under the influence of these hormones, and because the follicles are growing, so the granulosa cells are actually starting to secrete estrogen. So that's why you can actually see the estradiol, the ovarian hormones, also start to increase. And at the stage of day 14, which is usually the time of the ovulation, there will be a spike in your luteinizing hormone as well as your FSH that eventually leads to the process of ovulation to take place here. Okay, so because ovulation has taken place, the granulosa cells are actually starting to degenerate, so you will actually see a drop in your estrogen levels here. In the ovarian hormones, they start to drop. But as the oocyte continues its journey in the fallopian tube, the ruptured Graafian follicle then actually becomes what we know as the Graafian follicles. Sorry, the corpus luteum. So that actually denotes the start of the luteal phase. Okay, so the first 14 days is literally the follicle phase, which is the growing of the maturation of your follicles. And then upon ovulation, you start the luteal phase, which the corpus luteum actually takes over. And you can see the moment the Graafian follicle ruptures, there's a drop in your hormone levels, because the corpus luteum actually starts to produce the progesterone. Okay, it produces progesterone, which actually inhibits the follicle stimulating hormones in the anterior pituitary gland. Okay, so the corpus luteum actually is an important structure after ovulation, because the secretion of progesterone by the corpus luteum actually helps maintain the uterine lining. Okay, as you can see, when your progesterone levels are high, the thickness of your endometrium is also very much thicker. Okay, so this actually relates back to the function of your endometrium, where it has to be thick enough and be ready enough to receive the fertilized ovum. Okay, so because ovulation has taken place, so we don't know if this ovum is going to be fertilized or it's not going to be fertilized. So just in case it gets fertilized, we need it to have a proper space for implantation, and that's why the endometrium lining is actually quite thick at this phase, and this is literally contributed by the progesterone, which is secreted by the corpus luteum. So that's why your corpus luteum actually hangs around for a while in your ovaries before it degenerates into your corpus albicans, because in case there is fertilization, the fertilized embryo needs to implant in the endometrium lining, and until the placenta of the embryo forms and takes over the role of maintaining the endometrial lining, the corpus luteum actually does that role for us. Okay, so the corpus luteum functions to produce progesterone to ensure the endometrial lining is maintained until the placenta takes over its role. So once the placenta takes over, the corpus luteum will start to degenerate. But that is the case when there is pregnancy. If there is no pregnancy, what happens is the corpus luteum will start to degenerate. Once the ovum is disintegrated in the fallopian tube, then the corpus luteum will start to degenerate, and the levels of your progesterone hormones will start dropping. And you can see, because the progesterone level starts dropping, the endometrial lining is no longer maintained. It cannot maintain the lining, and it starts to slog off, or it starts to be removed, and that's when you get your menses or the menstrual flow. So this is literally the entire cycle. One last thing before you go, do you think you can identify the follicle that you're looking at?